Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before we get started on tonight's story, I'm going to let you know about Plague Doctor, who was actually Arusius, who is the author of tonight's story. If you guys want to see more from Arusius or hear stories directly from the man himself, take a look at the link in the description down below. I'll also put a little link in that eye you'll see in the top right corner of your screen that'll link you over to Dr. Plague. And now, on to tonight's story. The cabin in the woods had been abandoned for years, but one night, a candle burned in the window. The fire crackled as we sat in the front yard, the crickets tuning up and the little stream lapping at the banks of the small channel that bore it. The snow melt had been thick that year, and the small, cold snap that we had experienced the first week of June hadn't hurt it any. I had been living with Grandpa for nearly a year now, 10 months to be exact, and he had been making these bonfires a near constant Friday even since the snow melted in the spring. They suited me just fine. I had been cleaning up the spring limb falls since April, and the bonfires made a perfect excuse to get rid of them. Wait, you were just wandering in the woods? Found a house? Grandpa snorted. You telling the story or am I? I raised a hand in placation and invited him to continue. Grandpa didn't like to be interrupted. There was a little more to it than that. Aren't you paying attention? I looked away sheepishly. I'd been kind of hypnotized by the sounds of nature, and had only been half listening to Grandpa's story. He was just so peaceful out here at night, with only the fire and the bubble of darkness surrounding us. I like Grandpa's story almost as much as you all seem to, but I still get distracted every now and again. Grandpa settled himself again, giving me a look that clearly bemoaned the attention spans of the young, and began his story again. I was young when this happened. It was after my friend became a tree, before Grandma started to teach me the ways of the woods. I had started taking to the woods more often, not having anyone to play with much. Sometimes I'd come all weekend to the Appalachian Hills. My parents never worried about me. They knew that I knew the hills and hollers like the back of my hand. So when I kissed Mama goodbye one morning, my rucksack packed, she told me to be home Saturday night, so I wouldn't be late for church on Sunday. I told her I would and set out to camp the woods for the next 2 nights. This was high summer, late June, early July, and it was about as hot as it ever had got beneath the canopy of trees. I was looking forward to finding my way to a spot. I knew a little creek. I'd fish, I'd swim, generally enjoy my time in the woods. When I got to the widow's house, however, I hunkered down for a moment to make sure the coast was clear. Not because I was afraid of any widow, mind you. She was supposed to have been dead for a long time, but her house still remained, and you never knew who might be using it. It was just after the Depression. Sometimes vague tramps would use the woods for long-term camping. I heard of them robbing people and worse. Didn't want to blunder into a group of them who might be squatting into the widow's house. Now, the widow's house was a bit of an anomaly in the area. Terry Manx, just called the widow by the time I'd come along, had lived out in the woods till she was 100 years old, they said. Her husband had gone to fight the Civil War, leaving her and her young son behind. He had never returned. When her son disappeared a few years after the end of the war, the widow had been heartbroken. She lived alone in that house. The travelers said they often saw a candle burning in the window, as if to guide her son or her husband home again. She lived in that house from 1830 until she died in 1910. The townsfolk didn't discover that she had passed till someone noticed that the candle was no longer being lit, and went to check on her one fateful night. The man had knocked. Upon receiving no answer, he'd gone inside to check on the poor widow. She had lived there for so long, remaining independent till the last, and it was said that he found her in a rocking chair as she sat before the remains of her last fire. The candlestick was frozen in her mummified hand. Neither decay nor corruption had touched her. She'd simply dried into a wrinkled corpse that had been buried in her chair. Or so the legend said. As if taking its cue from its mistress, the house remained eternal. It had sat in that little clearing since her death, and no amount of snow on the roof or water on the valley seemed to change it. 30 years after her death, the roof remained on, and the windows remained intact. The house sat like a monument. It would likely remain to this day, if it weren't for me. Now, I wasn't afraid of anything like that. Even so, you wouldn't catch me staying there after the sun went down, tramps or no tramps. After a few minutes of watching the house to make sure it wasn't full of homeless people, I went along and put the house out of sight and mind. I spent the next 2 days doing what I had wanted to do. Fished in the stream, explored the woods, cooked my catch over a fire. Friday night saw a creature approach my fire that I'd later call a moonchild. Smelled my fish, came to have a look. That's a story for another time. I don't want to muddy the waters too much. The story is about the widow's house, and more specifically, the widow's candle. So Saturday morning dawned warm and clear. I decided to spend the day on the banks as I fished for some dinner to bring home with me. As I lay on the bank, pole balanced against my stomach, I found myself warm, comfy, and utterly at peace. I could hear the birds as they called through the trees. I could hear the squirrels at play as they moved through the brush. I heard the gentle lap of the stream and a splash of a small fish that swam there. Before I quite knew what was happening, I had slipped off into a nap. I awoke to find the sun riding low, and my bait was gone. I judged by the sun that it was about 7 o'clock, cursed myself for sleeping away most of the day. I packed up quickly, but I knew that I'd never make it home before dark. The sun was sinking even as I packed my things into a rucksack, started making my way home with a haste. I could hear the night birds beginning to tune up, and I wanted to be well and out of the woods before it got too dark. Regardless of my wants, it was fully dark by the time I made my way back to the widow's house. As I got close, I felt like I could see a light coming from it. The forest is black, dark at night, moon or no moon, and the light coming through the trees is like a beacon in the night. Thought about taking a wider trail around it after seeing that light, being sure it'd be lit by a hobo campfire, but I was 10. I don't know a 10-year-old that wasn't possessed by a wellspring of curiosity. As I got closer, I put my pack down, and I crept towards the house like an Indian raider on a prowl. The closer I got to the house, the less sure I became that it was a campfire. The blistering fire became smaller and smaller until I came to the edge of the clearing and I found the source of the light. It was a candle. A single candle left burning on the windowsill, just as the widow used to do when she was calling her menfolk home. I hunkered at the edge of the property line looking for people who might be hiding, finding no one. This would be a great way to draw in the curiosity after all. Leave a candle burning on the sill just like it says in the stories, wait for someone to approach. You could hide beside the porch or even in the barn, and once you had him good and interested, spring out and have him. It was a great plan, except I didn't see anyone around. The porch held no hulking brutes or half-starved tramps. The barn was of the pole variety. The hiding places were minimal. They'd have to be poor fellows indeed to hide anywhere on the property. That just left someone in the house. I should have turned around and left, but I wanted a story to tell my friends when I went to school next. How exciting it'd be to sit in the warm sun on the playground, tell them all how I had seen a candle burning in the widow's house. How they would gasp and sigh when he told them about how I had gone to the window to see who had lit the candle. I could already see them putting their hands to their mouths, looking shocked when I told them what I had seen inside the place of bones. My curiosity wasn't the only thing that lured me towards that house. I'd always been a sucker for a good story, especially when it's a story I can tell others. But I suspect you've already guessed that. Standing on the porch with that candle burning behind the ancient glass window, gazing in on the one-room farmhouse that I suspect had once been considered spacious. I expected to see people in there. Maybe even people trying to hide. I kept myself low to avoid being seen. Inside, though, there was very little to hide behind. Kitchen table, a few chairs, a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a few bookshelves, and, to my horror, a rocking chair. A rocking chair with someone in it. A person was sitting in front of the fireplace, and I could see a dying fire smoldering in the grate. They were dressed in a long black dress, complete with a bonnet, and a pair of knitting needles were moving slowly in their lap as they sat at work. The chair was going back and forth slowly. The whole scene seemed almost surreal. I backed away, trying to get back to my pack and get the hell out of there with my story. That was when the door creaked open with a noise like a swollen hinge and a mouthful of rust. The voice that followed, it sounded twice as creaky and just as spooky. "Thomas, is that you? It's so dark, son. Can you come help your poor mother?" I was frozen there, looking back at the open door as the raspy croak beckoned me inside. You likely won't believe me. None of my school friends did when I told them, but I was torn as I stood there with my fear crawling like bugs up my spine. On the one hand, the whole situation was just so weird, and all I wanted was to show my heels all the way home. On the other, this woman sounded old, possibly infirm, and my mother had always taught me to help people in need. It was the Christian thing to do, after all. And as the creaky old voice asked if I was there, I took my first shaky steps onto the porch and walked into the widow's house. The inside was Spartan, but it was warm and dry for a house that had been empty for 30 years. I could now see why the vagrants liked it so much, and I imagined I could smell pastries and fresh bread as I crossed the threshold. Fire was warm too, and when the door didn't slam shut behind me to trap me inside, I felt that perhaps this was just some old woman who was just a little lost. "Thomas? Is that really you? I waited so long for you, boy. Why have you kept your mother waiting?" "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm not Thomas. I think you must be mistaken." She cut me off before I could say more, though, swishing her hand at the candle on the windowsill. "Bring that candle over here so I can have a look at you, Tommy. My eyes aren't what they used to be, and it's so dark in here." See, I thought that was odd. She was sitting right in front of the fire, but I was too well-mannered to argue with her. I was becoming less and less afraid with every step I took. And when I picked the candle up, I saw the flame waft a little before it went out. She tutted then, though how could she see that the flame had gone out was beyond me. But her words were so good-natured as she called to me to light it again. "Silly boy, you've gone and put out the flame. Come light it again so your old mother can have a look at you." I walked past her, her sewing needles still clicking as her old chair creaked away merrily. Bending low, I stuck the tip of the candle into the dying flames and saw it wink back to life. Then I turned, candle held out before me, as I started to ask if that was better. When I caught sight of her, I came to realize why she thought it was so dark. The woman had no eyes. Her face looked like a burlap sack, like a scarecrow whose face had been drawn a little too well, and her toothless mouth grinned wetly at me. I saw the hollow pits where her eyes should be. It was the widow, sure as I'm still here, and when I dropped the candle onto her, she went up like a pyre. I stood in horror as she burned, her mouth open, splitting as she laughed and laughed. Such a warm welcome, and as she croaked out her cobwebby mirth, I ran for the door. I could feel the heat behind me as the dry boards of the widow's house caught fire. But I never stopped running. I didn't bother with my pack either. I just ran for home, the image of that eyeless old mummy carved perfectly into my mind forever. When I got home, my mother was waiting for me. All her bluster at me being late and lost as I threw my arms around her, I never told her what had happened. She never asked. At that moment, I was just happy to have the protective walls of her arms around me. Went back for my pack a few days after school. It was exactly where I had left it, but I couldn't help noticing the burnt husk of the widow's house. See, the house had burned to the ground, nothing left but ashes and charred boards. I never went near that spot again. People of the town thought it had been the vagrants, and I never tried to dissuade them from that idea. The children I told the story to never seemed to believe me, and I was always careful not to tell it to any adults. They think it an omission of guilt, and I didn't want anyone to think that it was a fire I had set on purpose. The spot remained barren to this day. Nothing will grow there. Nature seems unwilling to come and retake its space. I thought about going back there to pay my respects sometimes, but it's not a place I'd ever want to return to. I think, deep down, I'm still afraid of seeing her there. Toothless mouth, laughing, and sunken pits looking for her lost son. It's an image that I'll carry forever. The crackling fire caught a pine knot then, and I was pulled from the story as I jumped. Is there anything out there in those woods that isn't horrifying? I asked, finishing my beer as I threw the bottle into the woods. This was a habit I'd picked up from Grandpa. Seemed as natural as breathing now. Of course, he said. You've seen some of it, but world's full of dangers that most likely any animal can be conquered if you know how. Your studies are coming along well. By the time you learn all that I have to teach, I'm sure I won't feel so hesitant about dying. I patted his hand. Hopefully, not for a long time yet. He smiled, but I thought it looked a little sad. We can only hope. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I just wanted to tell you thank you for watching tonight's video, or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. And as always, I want to give a very big thank you to everybody who supports me on Patreon. If you scroll down to the description at the very bottom, you'll find a whole bunch of people there. Also, we've included this nice little scrolling thing because the number of people who support me on Patreon has gotten so big that I'm afraid it might actually max out the description. So we've included this here as the little scrolling text on the end screens. So everybody on that scrolling text, everybody I'm about to mention right now and mispronounce all of your names, and everybody who can donate even $1, thank you so much. A very big thank you to Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Stephanie Butler, Reaper61167, Bobby Karman, Tristain, Pelton, Chance Burnett, Diana Kraus, Thiccy McQuicky, SamaHigh, CrusaderChocobo, SpookyShel, Atomaurus, Grand Moth the Milky, Big Smoke 369, Captain Scurvy, SaltyIrishPoet, Estebean, Brayden Morris, Nate Kuhl, HorrorFan1212, Hour Minute Second Time, Reznak, David Martin, Scare-ington the Unkempt, Robert Malcolm, Angelus, Spanky, Snoochie Boochie, Seclude, Lupita Galvin, That Creepy Chick, Tyler Fletcher, Merxenum, Red Shadow Cat, Xavier the Cheyenne, Demix, Sean Cadieu-baker, 6 Gay Rats in a Trenchcoat, Turtleman, Rob Like Sharp Things, Cryolinian, Xavier Graphius, Lord Life's Best, Goring Tramagasi, Maria Walker, Emily Mitchell, Crazy Kid, Mr. Marcus Blitz, Eka Limchok, Dirt Diver 030, Matt Bach, Voice of Sand, Coffee Zombie, Hidden Tiger, Shelly J, Jeremy H, Psychomel, Nana, Deleted Account, Melted Lake, Tali Sue, William King, Darth Miver, Michael Ortiz, Titanic Aries, Bardo Hawk 764, Lambda M98, Harley, Sashi Suzaku, Cronut 509, Kaylee Ambrose, Suji Campbell, Stricken, Freddy Krueger, Happy Birthday Jason Wilson, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Benjamin Welverick, Cryptic Nightmares, Kiri the Sloth, Fester's Lampshade, Sky Harbor, Nico Kyle, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, and Corey Kenshin. As always, thank you guys so much, because you guys help me do everything that I do here. You guys help pay authors for stories and commission stories and do everything that I can do to make this channel and make this podcast the best it could possibly be. So thank you all for supporting me here. And as always, everyone, sweet dreams.